and the dream of Kon-Tiki. Picture this, a clearing in the Peruvian jungle where the air hangs thick with moisture and the rich scent of freshly cut wood. Massive balsa logs lie scattered across the forest floor like fallen giants, their pale surfaces still weeping sap. Indigenous workers move between them with practiced hands, their backs bent to the ancient rhythm of rope and timber, binding these forest titans together with nothing more than hemp cord and centuries-old knowledge. This is where madness takes shape. This is where a dream becomes wood and rope and desperate hope. I know you understand something about impossible dreams, about lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling while your mind churns through the weight you carry. The vision only you can see, the thing you're building that everyone else thinks is folly. Tonight, as you finally set aside the endless demands of leadership, let me tell you about a man who faced that same darkness and sailed straight into it on a raft that shouldn't have floated. His name was Thor Heyerdahl, and in 1947 he was about to attempt something so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that the very mention of it made serious academics shake their heads in dismay. He was going to prove that ancient peoples could have crossed the Pacific Ocean by doing it himself, exactly as they would have done it 500 years ago. But let's step back. The story begins not in that humid jungle clearing, but in the mind of a young Norwegian explorer who couldn't let go of a question that haunted him. Heyerdahl had spent time in the Marquesas Islands, living among the Polynesian people, listening to their stories, studying their features, their culture, their legends. And something didn't add up. The accepted wisdom of his time was absolute, carved in academic stone. The Polynesian islands had been populated from Asia, from the west. The prevailing winds, the ocean currents, the very logic of geography. Everything pointed to migration flowing from west to east across the Pacific. It was settled science, case closed. But Thor Heyerdahl had seen something others had missed. He'd noticed that the sweet potato, a plant native to South America, somehow existed in Polynesia long before any recorded contact between the continents. He'd studied the massive stone statues of Easter Island and seen in them an echo of the monumental architecture of pre-Columbian Peru. He'd listened to Polynesian legends that spoke of ancestors arriving from the east, from the direction of the rising sun. What if everyone was wrong? What if the impossible was actually inevitable? The academic establishment wasn't merely skeptical, they were dismissive. Distinguished professors explained, with the patience reserved for particularly slow children, that the winds and currents of the Pacific made eastward travel impossible. Ancient peoples, they insisted, simply couldn't have made such a journey. The technology didn't exist. The knowledge wasn't there. It was romanticism, not science. But here's what those professors didn't understand about the weight Heyerdahl carried. When you've seen something others can't see, when you've glimpsed a truth that challenges everything everyone believes, you can't simply let it go. It becomes part of you. It whispers to you in quiet moments. It demands to be proven. So Heyerdahl made a decision that would have seemed insane to any reasonable person. If ancient South Americans could have reached Polynesia by raft, then he would prove it, by building such a raft and making the journey himself. The plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. He would construct a vessel using only materials and techniques available to pre-Columbian peoples. No modern navigation equipment, no radio for emergencies, no backup plan, just balsa wood, rope, and the same stars that had guided ancient navigators across the vast emptiness of the Pacific. And so we return to that jungle clearing in Peru, where impossibility was taking shape one rope at a time. The balsa trees had been chosen with meticulous care. These weren't just any logs. They were the bones of Heyerdahl's dream, each one selected for its specific properties. Balsa wood, despite its lightness, becomes incredibly strong when waterlogged. The ancient peoples had known this. They'd understood that the ocean itself would become part of their vessel's strength. 9 logs formed the foundation, the longest nearly 45 feet, tapering toward the shorter ones at the edges to create the classic raft profile. No nails held them together, no modern adhesives, just rope, miles and miles of hemp rope, wound and knotted according to techniques that predated the Spanish conquest. The indigenous workers moved with a rhythm that spoke of genetic memory. Their hands knew these knots, these patterns of binding. They were helping to resurrect something their ancestors had perfected, a technology so simple it seemed primitive, yet so effective it had once carried entire civilizations across the world's largest ocean. But as the raft took shape, so did the magnitude of what Heyerdahl was attempting. This wasn't just about proving a theory. This was about 6 men trusting their lives to a construction that modern maritime experts insisted would fall apart within days of hitting the open ocean. The crew he'd assembled was as carefully chosen as the logs themselves. Each man brought something essential to the expedition. Knut Haugland and Torstein Rabi were radio operators, though their equipment would remain silent unless disaster struck. Eric Hesselberg was the navigator, a man who could read the stars like others read books. Hermann Wotzinger was the engineer, tasked with documenting everything for science. Bengt Danielsson was the anthropologist, there to observe and record the human elements of their journey. And then there was Thor himself, the dreamer whose vision had brought them all to this impossible moment. As they worked in that jungle clearing, binding log to log with patient precision, each man must have wrestled with his own version of the weight you know so well. That mixture of excitement and terror that comes with committing everything to an uncertain outcome. The knowledge that you've moved beyond the point where retreat is possible. They named their vessel Kon-Tiki, after the legendary Inca sun god, who, according to Polynesian mythology, had sailed west across the Pacific after being defeated in battle. It was a name that carried the weight of legend, the promise of vindication, and the very real possibility of becoming a monument to human folly. The raft measured 45 feet long and 18 feet wide. A bamboo cabin, barely large enough for 6 sleeping bags, rose from its center. A single square sail, painted with the image of Kon-Tiki himself, would catch whatever wind the Pacific chose to offer. Provisions for the journey filled every available space. Enough food and water to sustain 6 men for what they hoped would be a 100-day voyage to Polynesia. But as they prepared to transport their creation from the jungle to the coast, doubts multiplied like storm clouds on the horizon. Maritime experts who examined the raft shook their heads in dismay. The ropes would stretch and loosen, they warned. The logs would separate. The vessel would simply come apart in the first serious weather. Even more troubling were the warnings about the journey itself. The Pacific wasn't just vast. It was actively hostile to their enterprise. The Humboldt Current would carry them northwest, away from any land. If they missed the Polynesian islands, if they sailed past that scattered chain of tiny targets in an ocean larger than all the world's land masses combined, there would be nothing ahead of them but empty water until they reached the coast of Asia. And yet, sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the risk of failure. Sometimes it's the certainty that if you don't try, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Heyerdahl understood this. His crew understood this. They'd moved beyond rational calculation into that realm where vision becomes more powerful than fear. The night before they were to move the raft to the ocean, Heyerdahl walked among those bound logs one final time. Tomorrow, this collection of trees and rope would either vindicate his theory or become his tomb. There was no middle ground, no partial success, no moral victory in noble failure. The jungle around him pulsed with the sounds of night, insects and birds, and the distant calls of animals whose ancestors had witnessed the construction of countless rafts like this one. How many dreamers had stood in clearings like this, preparing to trust their lives to wood and rope and the vast indifference of the sea? But here's what Heyerdahl understood about the weight he carried, the same thing you understand about what you're building. Sometimes the most rational thing you can do is something that looks completely irrational to everyone else. Sometimes the careful, measured approach isn't just wrong, it's impossible. Tomorrow, they would drag Kon-Tiki to the Pacific and discover whether ancient wisdom was stronger than modern skepticism. Tomorrow, they would learn whether courage could navigate where knowledge feared to go. But tonight, in that clearing where madness had taken the shape of wood and rope, Thor Heyerdahl allowed himself one last moment of doubt, and then let it go, like a prayer offered to the vast darkness of the ocean that waited beyond the trees. The raft was ready. The question was whether they were ready for what the raft would teach them about the thin line between vision and delusion, between breakthrough and catastrophe. Soon they would find out. Setting sail, a world adrift. The morning of April 28, 1947, arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that seems to mock human uncertainty. In the harbor at Callao, Peru, the Kon-Tiki bobbed gently against the dock, her yellow parrot sail furled, her 9 balsa logs dark with seawater that had already begun to teach them their first lessons about buoyancy and faith. You know that feeling, don't you? Standing at the edge of something irreversible, when all the planning and preparation narrows down to a single moment of commitment. When the weight you carry shifts from preparation to execution and there's no turning back. The crew gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, each man carrying his own private conversation with doubt. Eric Hesselberg, the navigator, ran his fingers once more over his charts, knowing that beyond the first few hundred miles they would be writing their own map. Knut Haugland and Torstein Rabi, the radio operators, checked their equipment with the methodical precision of men who understood that their voices might soon be the only thread connecting this floating experiment to the world they were leaving behind. Hermann Watzinger, the engineer, examined the rope lashings that held their world together. No nails, no metal joints, just the ancient wisdom of knots and the faith that indigenous knowledge could carry them across 4,000 miles of indifferent ocean. And Bengt Danielsson, the anthropologist, stood quietly at the stern, perhaps contemplating the irony that he was about to become the subject of the very kind of study he had spent years conducting from the safety of libraries and lecture halls. As the sun climbed higher, curious onlookers began to gather. Word had spread through the port about these mad Norwegians and their impossible raft. Some came to witness history, others came to see what folly looked like before the ocean claimed it. The Peruvian Navy tugboat Guardian Rios took up her towing line with ceremonial precision. There would be no dramatic departure under sail. The raft needed to clear the harbor and the coastal shipping lanes before she could be released to find her own relationship with wind and current. And then, almost anticlimactically, they were moving. The shoreline began its slow retreat, Peru becoming first a collection of buildings, then a smudge of brown against green hills, then a memory on the horizon. The seabirds that had followed them from the harbor wheeled and cried overhead, as if offering some ancient blessing or warning that human ears could no longer interpret. When the tugboat finally cast off the towline, the silence that followed was profound. Not empty silence, but the kind of quiet that holds infinite possibility. The ocean stretched away in all directions, an endless manuscript written in shades of blue and grey, waiting for them to add their small story to its vast collection of human ambitions and surrenders. The first thing they noticed was the sound, or rather the symphony of sounds that city dwellers never hear, the constant whisper of water moving through and around the balsa logs, the rhythmic creaking of rope under load, the soft percussion of waves against the bow, each one slightly different, like a conversation in a language they were only beginning to understand. Thor stood at the steering oar, feeling the raft's response to his touch, or perhaps feeling his own response to the raft's ancient wisdom. This was not a machine to be controlled, but a living thing to be partnered with. The balsa logs rode the swells with a motion that was part dance, part negotiation with forces far greater than human will. The taste of salt spray became their first shared sacrament. Not the occasional splash of a weekend sailor, but the constant presence of the ocean on their lips, in their hair, seasoning their food and their dreams. They were being slowly transformed from land creatures into something else, something that belonged neither fully to the sea nor to the solid certainties they had left behind. By the second day, routines began to emerge, not the rigid schedules of their former lives, but the organic rhythms that arise when humans adapt to forces beyond their control. Meals became events measured not by clocks, but by hunger and the sun's position. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by the need to adjust the sail or check their position, or simply to marvel at the Southern Cross wheeling overhead in skies so clear they seemed like portals to infinity. The Pacific revealed its moods gradually, sometimes mirror calm, reflecting clouds so perfectly that they seemed to be sailing through sky rather than water. Other times restless, sending long swells that lifted the raft like gentle hands, carrying them forward on the very pulse of the planet. Navigation became a meditation on uncertainty. Their compass spun lazily, affected by the metal-free construction that made traditional instruments unreliable. Instead, they learned to read the ocean itself. The color changes that hinted at depth, the wind patterns that spoke of weather systems beyond the horizon, the flight paths of birds that might indicate distant land or simply the vast emptiness that stretched ahead. Each evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of copper and gold, they would gather around their small radio and attempt contact with the world they had left behind. Sometimes, the crackling voices came through clearly, bringing news of a civilization that seemed increasingly abstract. Other times, static was their only companion, and they were reminded of just how alone they were in this liquid wilderness. The crew dynamics settled into something like a family, not always harmonious, but bound together by circumstances that made petty disagreements seem trivial. When tensions arose, the ocean itself seemed to intervene, sending a spectacular sunset or a pod of curious dolphins to remind them of the privilege they shared. What strikes me most about those early days is how quickly the extraordinary became ordinary. The morning ritual of checking the lashings, the evening calculation of their position, the constant background awareness of wind direction and wave height. They were developing new senses, new ways of reading the world that their land-bound selves had never needed. And perhaps that's what you're doing too, in your own way. Learning to navigate by different stars, developing new senses for the currents and weather patterns of what you're building. The weight you carry is teaching you to read signs that others miss, to find your direction even when traditional compasses spin uselessly. The Kon-Tiki sailed on, her crew slowly shedding their old selves like snakes shed skin, becoming something new, something that belonged to the vast conversation between human ambition and oceanic indifference. Behind them, Peru had vanished completely. Ahead lay 4,000 miles of uncertainty and the growing realization that they had crossed more than just a harbor mouth. They had crossed the line between the world of theories and the world where theories meet their truth. The ocean would be their teacher now, and the ocean, as they were beginning to understand, was a patient but unforgiving instructor in the art of letting go. Ocean's embrace, days and nights on the raft. The first lesson the ocean taught them was rhythm, not the mechanical tick of clocks or the urgent pulse of deadlines, but something far older, something that moved in the rise and fall of swells, in the whisper of wind through bamboo, in the gentle creak of rope against balsa wood. By the third day, their bodies had begun to synchronize with this ancient metronome. They woke not to alarms, but to the subtle shift in light that preceded dawn. They ate when hunger called, slept when darkness fell, and found themselves moving with the raft's gentle motion rather than fighting against it. Thor Heyerdahl watched his crew adapt with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose theory was proving itself not in books or lecture halls, but in the lived experience of 6 men learning to trust what their ancestors had known. The weight he carried, the burden of being right or catastrophically wrong, began to distribute itself across broader shoulders. The ocean was becoming their shared responsibility now. The sunsets were their first revelation of beauty beyond survival. Each evening, as the sun traced its arc toward the western horizon, the crew would gather on deck not from duty, but from an almost magnetic pull toward wonder. The Pacific sky became their cathedral, painted fresh each night in colors that seemed impossible. Deep crimsons bleeding into molten gold, purple clouds stretched like silk across an infinite canvas. Hermann Watzinger, their meteorologist, would attempt to explain the atmospheric conditions that created such displays, but his scientific words felt small against the vastness before them. The sunset didn't need explanation, it needed witnesses, and they had become perhaps the most isolated witnesses on Earth, 6 men watching the day die in solitude, more complete than any monastery could offer. As darkness claimed the sky, the stars emerged with an intensity that city dwellers never see. Out here, beyond the reach of electric lights, beyond the interference of civilization's glow, the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. Navigation became poetry. Erich Hesselberg would take his readings, but even he found himself lingering with the sextant, not from necessity, but from the simple pleasure of communion with celestial guides that had led countless voyagers before them. The nights brought their own rhythm. Someone always stood watch, but the ocean seemed to sleep lightly, rocking them with the gentleness of a mother's arms. They learned to distinguish between the sounds of safety and the whispers that demanded attention, the difference between the raft settling into a swell and the sharper note that meant a rope needed checking, but it was the sea life that truly welcomed them into the Pacific's embrace. Flying fish were their first ambassadors, silver bullets that would launch themselves from wave to wave, sometimes landing on deck with a wet slap that provided both surprise and breakfast. The crew learned to appreciate these unexpected gifts, these small offerings from an ocean that seemed determined to feed them. Knut Haugland, their radio operator, developed a particular fascination with these aerial visitors. Here was a creature that had solved the problem of existing between two worlds, equally at home in water and air, committed fully to neither. Perhaps he saw something of their own journey in these fish. They too were suspended between worlds, no longer bound to land but not yet claimed by the sea. The dolphins came later, and their arrival felt like acceptance into some ancient fraternity. Pods would appear without warning, racing alongside the raft with what could only be described as playful curiosity. They seemed to understand that the Kon-Tiki posed no threat, carried no engine noise or chemical wake. This was a vessel that moved with the ocean rather than against it. Bengt Danielsson, their anthropologist, would spend hours watching these encounters, making notes about behavior that seemed almost ceremonial. The dolphins would perform elaborate leaps and dives, as if putting on a show for their strange visitors. Or perhaps, he wondered, they were conducting their own research, studying these peculiar surface dwellers who had chosen to trust their lives to logs and rope. The psychological weight of isolation revealed itself gradually. At first, the novelty sustained them. Every sunrise brought new wonders. Every sunset painted fresh masterpieces. But as days became weeks, the mind began to crave stimulation that the endless horizon couldn't provide. They developed rituals to anchor themselves. Morning coffee became ceremony, evening meals stretched longer. Filled with stories that grew more elaborate with each telling, Torstein Rabi would craft small objects from scraps of rope and wood, his hands needing work even when there was no urgent task at hand. The radio schedules provided crucial connection to the world they'd left behind, but even these began to feel like messages from another planet. Reports of political tensions, economic concerns, the daily urgencies of civilization. They seemed increasingly abstract when measured against the immediate reality of wind and wave, sun and star. Heyerdahl understood that this psychological journey was as important as their physical progress across the Pacific. They were not just testing a theory about ancient migration. They were experiencing the mental transformation that such journeys demanded, the shedding of modern anxieties, the acceptance of rhythms beyond human control, the gradual shift from fighting uncertainty to dancing with it. The raft itself became their teacher in patience. Unlike a ship that could be steered with precision, the Kon-Tiki moved according to principles older than navigation. They could influence their direction, but they could not command it. This lesson in surrender came hard to men raised in an age of mechanical control, but it came nonetheless. They learned to read the ocean's moods, to sense when weather was building beyond the horizon, to feel the subtle changes in current and wind that would determine their path. The water around them shifted from deep blue to green to blue again, each shade telling stories about depth and distance from land. Small maintenance tasks took on meditative quality. Checking ropes, adjusting the sail, preparing meals. These became not chores, but participation in the larger rhythm that sustained them. Every action connected to their survival, but also to their growing understanding of what it meant to live in partnership with forces infinitely larger than themselves. The weight you carry in your own endeavors, those 2 a.m. calculations about resources and timing, the careful balance between ambition and reality. Perhaps it finds echo in these men learning to trust their theory to the vast indifference of the Pacific. They, too, had crossed the line between planning and execution, between the safety of preparation and the truth that only experience could reveal. And the ocean continued its patient instruction in the art of letting go, teaching them that some journeys cannot be rushed, some destinations cannot be forced, and some victories require the courage to surrender control while never abandoning purpose. The stars wheeled overhead, marking time in measurements that dwarfed human urgency, while 6 men learned to find peace in the space between certainty and hope. Whispers of the deep, but the ocean held deeper mysteries than starlight and surrender. On their 23rd day adrift, as the morning sun painted the Pacific in shades of copper and gold, Herman noticed something moving beneath them. Not the familiar dance of dolphins or the silver flash of flying fish, but something vast and deliberate, a shadow that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of their small world. There, he whispered, pointing down through the crystal-clear water that had become their window into another realm. The others gathered at the raft's edge, and what they saw defied the comfortable rhythms they had grown to know. A whale shark, magnificent and alien, glided beneath the Kon-Tiki with the unhurried grace of a living cathedral. Its spotted hide caught fragments of sunlight, creating patterns that shifted like ancient script across its massive form. For long moments, no one spoke. The creature moved with such deliberate calm that time itself seemed to pause, as if the ocean were revealing one of its most carefully guarded secrets. Here was power without urgency, presence without performance. The whale shark neither hurried nor hesitated, it simply was. You know this feeling, don't you? Those moments when the weight you carry suddenly feels small against something immeasurably larger. When the urgency that drives your days encounters a force that operates on entirely different principles. The whale shark reminds us, that beneath the surface of our immediate concerns lie depths we can barely fathom. Thorstein reached down, his hand hovering just above the water's surface, as if he might touch this gentle giant. But the creature had already begun to fade into the blue depths, leaving them with nothing but the memory of its presence and the strange comfort of knowing they were not alone in the vastness. The encounter lingered in their minds as the days rolled on, but the ocean was not content to let them drift in peaceful contemplation. On their 27th day, the western horizon began to darken with a different kind of mystery. Storm clouds gathered like an army of shadows, and the wind that had been their faithful companion suddenly turned restless and demanding. Heyerdahl watched the approaching weather with the measured calm that had carried him this far. He had learned, as all who build something from nothing must learn, that challenges arrive not when we feel prepared for them, but when they choose to arrive. The question is never whether difficulties will come, it's whether we'll meet them with panic or purpose. The storm struck just after sunset, transforming their peaceful world into something wild and untamed. Rain lashed the raft in sheets, and waves that had once rocked them gently now rose like moving mountains, lifting the Kon-Tiki high before dropping it into valleys of churning water. But here, in the heart of uncertainty, something remarkable happened. The crew moved not with frantic energy, but with the practiced coordination of men who had learned to trust each other completely. Eric secured the radio equipment while Knut checked the rope bindings that held their world together. Bengt protected their precious water supplies, and Herman adjusted the sail with hands that had grown wise to the ocean's moods. There was no shouting over the wind, no desperate scrambling. They had become something more than 6 individual men. They had become a single organism, each part knowing instinctively what the others needed. This is what happens when people share not just a goal, but the daily reality of pursuing it together. The weight you carry becomes lighter when others understand not just what you're building, but why it matters. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely quiet. But it had also left them with a problem that would test everything they had learned about resourcefulness and determination. Several of the rope bindings that held the balsa logs together had loosened, and one of the center boards, crucial for steering, had been damaged. In any other circumstance, this might have been cause for despair. Here they were, thousands of miles from the nearest port, with no shipyard, no spare parts, no expert craftsman to call upon. Just 6 men, their accumulated knowledge, and whatever materials they carried with them. But Heyerdahl looked at the damage with the same steady gaze he had turned toward the storm. He had not come this far by expecting the journey to be easy. He had come this far by believing that solutions exist for those willing to think clearly and work patiently. They spent the morning diving beneath the raft, using techniques that would have made their ancestors proud. With nothing but rope and determination, they retightened the bindings that held their vessel together. For the centerboard, they improvised a repair using spare wood and the kind of creative problem-solving that emerges when failure is not an option. Watching them work, you might have seen something familiar. The same quiet focus you bring to the challenges that keep you awake at night. the same refusal to be defeated by problems that have no obvious solutions. The same understanding that building something worthwhile requires not just vision, but the willingness to fix what breaks along the way. As the repairs were completed and the Kon-Tiki resumed its westward journey, something had shifted among the crew. The storm and its aftermath had revealed not their vulnerability, but their strength. Not their dependence on outside help, but their capacity to solve problems with whatever resources they possessed. They had faced the ocean's power and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. They had encountered mysteries, the whale shark, the storm, the endless depths beneath them, and found in those mysteries not reasons for fear, but invitations to wonder. The afternoon sun found them sitting together on their small deck, sharing the simple meal that had become their daily communion. But the conversation had a different quality now. They spoke less of the destination that still lay weeks ahead, and more of the journey that was changing them day by day. Thorstein mentioned how his hands had grown stronger, more capable. Eric spoke of how his mind had learned to find calm in the midst of chaos. One by one, they acknowledged what the ocean was teaching them, that resilience is not about avoiding difficulty, but about meeting it with steady purpose. The whale shark had shown them mystery. The storm had shown them their own capability. And the endless horizon continued to show them that some journeys transform not just where we are, but who we become. As evening approached and the familiar ritual of sunset began, they understood something that you, lying there with tomorrow's challenges already forming in your mind, might recognize. That the weight we carry becomes not lighter through avoidance, but through the daily practice of bearing it well. The ocean whispered its approval as darkness fell, and 6 men continued their patient journey toward whatever lay beyond the horizon. Sustenance and solitude. The morning brought with it the eternal promise of sustenance from the sea. As the first light touched the water's surface, Knut Haugland was already preparing the fishing lines, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The ocean had taught them patience, but it had also taught them to recognize opportunity when it presented itself. You know this feeling, perhaps. That moment when preparation meets possibility, when all the careful groundwork you've laid suddenly aligns with circumstances beyond your control. The crew had learned to read the water's moods, to spot the telltale signs of fish moving beneath the surface. Dark patches that shifted and swirled, the sudden appearance of seabirds diving with purposeful intensity. When the first tuna struck Haugland's line, the entire raft seemed to come alive. The fish was magnificent. A creature of pure silver and strength, its body cutting through the air in a desperate arc before crashing back into the Pacific's embrace. But the hook held firm, and slowly, methodically, they brought their prize alongside the raft. There is something profound about catching your own food from the wilderness, something that connects you to every generation that came before. As they hauled the tuna aboard, its scales catching the morning light like scattered coins, the crew felt that ancient satisfaction. The weight of it in their hands, the promise of meals to come. Eric Hesselberg, their artist and navigator, would later write about these moments with particular reverence. How the simple act of preparing fish on the deck of their small raft felt like participating in a ritual as old as humanity itself. The careful cleaning, the precise cuts, the way they learned to waste nothing. Because out here, nothing could be wasted. Their meals became ceremonies of gratitude. Gathered on the bamboo deck as the sun climbed higher, they would share their catch with an appreciation that you might recognize from your own moments of hard-won success. When the deal finally closes after months of negotiation, when the product launch exceeds every projection, when the team you've built proves its worth under pressure. But between these moments of excitement and celebration lay the quieter rhythms that truly shaped their days. The long hours when the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions and time seemed to move by different rules entirely. Thor Heyerdahl had brought books, carefully selected volumes wrapped in waterproof canvas. Works of anthropology and exploration, yes, but also poetry and philosophy. During the heat of midday, when the sun made any physical exertion unbearable, they would retreat to whatever shade they could find and lose themselves in words. Hermann Watzinger, their meteorologist, kept meticulous records of wind patterns and ocean temperatures. But his journals also captured something more elusive. The way the light changed throughout the day, the subtle variations in the water's color. the endless parade of clouds that painted new masterpieces across the sky each hour. You understand this need to document, don't you? To capture not just the metrics and milestones, but the texture of the journey itself, the small observations that seem insignificant in the moment but later prove to contain the essence of everything you were building. Torstein Rabi, their radio operator, maintained their tenuous connection to the outside world. Each evening, he would tap out their position in Morse code, sending those precise coordinates across thousands of miles of empty ocean. But even he found himself drawn into longer and longer periods of silence, content simply to watch the endless dance of water and sky. The ocean revealed its moods gradually. Some days brought flying fish in such abundance that the crew would wake to find their breakfast already delivered, silver bodies scattered across the deck like gifts from the deep. Other days, the water lay so still, it seemed like polished glass, reflecting the clouds with perfect clarity until it became impossible to tell where the sea ended and the sky began. They learned to read the subtle signs that preceded each change, the way the wind would shift almost imperceptibly before picking up strength, how certain cloud formations promised rain, while others brought only the illusion of relief from the tropical sun, the particular quality of light that appeared just before sunset when the entire world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. These were lessons in attention, in the kind of deep observation that our modern world rarely demands or rewards. When was the last time you had the luxury of watching clouds for hours, of noticing the precise moment when afternoon becomes evening, of sitting quietly enough, long enough, to hear the subtle sounds beneath the obvious ones? On the Kon-Tiki, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Pacific, such attention became not luxury but necessity. Their lives depended on reading the ocean's signals correctly, on understanding the relationship between wind and wave, between current and weather, between the behavior of seabirds and the presence of land still far beyond the horizon. But perhaps more importantly, this enforced stillness gave them something that you, lying there with your mind racing through tomorrow's challenges, might recognize as precious beyond measure. Time to think. Real time. Not the fractured minutes between meetings or the exhausted moments before sleep, but long, uninterrupted hours when thoughts could develop and deepen naturally. Bengt Danielsson, their ethnographer, spent these quiet hours contemplating the very questions that had inspired their journey. What drove ancient peoples to risk everything on journeys into the unknown? How did they find the courage to leave familiar shores for the vast uncertainty of the open ocean? The answers, he began to understand, lay not in grand theories, but in simple human nature. The same restless spirit that had driven him to join this expedition. The same need to test ideas against reality that had convinced Heyerdahl to build a raft from balsa logs. The same willingness to embrace uncertainty that drives every true innovator. As the weeks passed, the crew found themselves changing in subtle but profound ways. Their skin darkened under the constant sun. Their movements adapted to the raft's gentle rolling motion until walking on solid ground would feel strange and unnatural. But the deeper changes were less visible. A growing comfort with silence, with solitude, with the patient rhythms of a world that moved by rules entirely different from those they had known on land. They were learning what the ocean had to teach about persistence, about the power of consistent, patient pressure applied over time. Each day, the trade winds pushed them a little further west. Each day, the current carried them toward their distant goal, not through dramatic effort or sudden breakthroughs, but through the simple accumulation of miles, hours, days. You know this kind of progress, don't you? The way meaningful things are built, not in moments of inspiration alone, but through the daily practice of showing up, of doing the work, of maintaining faith in a vision that others cannot yet see. As another evening approached and the familiar ritual of sunset began, the crew of the Kon-Tiki understood they were participating in something larger than their individual journey. They were proving that human determination, guided by careful observation and sustained by mutual trust, could navigate even the vastest uncertainties. The ocean continued its patient instruction as darkness fell, and 6 men settled into another night of dreams beneath stars that had guided countless voyagers before them. Land ahoy! Morning brought with it something extraordinary, something that made Herman Knutsen stop mid-sentence as he adjusted the sail, his weathered hand frozen against the rope. There, where the endless blue had met the sky for 97 days, was a line, the faintest suggestion of something solid, something that wasn't water. Land, whispered Thorstein, barely daring to breathe the word, then louder, with growing certainty, land ahoy. The effect was electric. 6 men who had learned the deep patience of the ocean suddenly became animated with an energy they'd almost forgotten they possessed. Heyerdahl grabbed his binoculars with trembling hands, while Hesselberg began calculating their position with renewed urgency. The weight they had carried, the months of preparation, the ridicule of experts, the leap of faith into the unknown. It was all leading to this moment. But what struck them most profoundly wasn't jubilation. It was recognition. As that green line on the horizon grew more distinct, as the first seabirds appeared overhead in graceful arcs, they understood something fundamental about what they were building. This wasn't just about proving a theory anymore. It wasn't simply about showing that ancient peoples could have made this journey. They had become those ancient peoples. They had lived their experience. They had felt what it meant to trust completely in materials that seemed impossible, to surrender to forces beyond their control, to find sustenance and meaning in the vast uncertainty of the open ocean. The approaching land represented vindication, yes, but more than that, it represented completion, a circle closing that had been opened centuries ago by nameless navigators who had possessed the same audacious faith, the same willingness to risk everything on careful observation and calculated hope. As the hours passed, the island revealed itself more fully. Palm trees became visible, swaying in tropical breezes they could almost feel. Coral reefs created patterns of light and dark in the shallowing water, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. The Kon-Tiki, faithful companion through every storm and calm, continued her steady approach, guided now not by human navigation alone, but by the same currents and winds that had carried voyagers for generations. Watzinger prepared his camera equipment with methodical care. This moment needed to be documented, not just for science, but for everyone who had ever stood at the edge of the impossible and wondered whether they possessed the courage to step forward. But even as excitement built, a deeper wisdom settled over the crew. They had learned something profound about the nature of arrival during their time on the ocean. The true destination had never been geographical. It had been internal. The real journey had been the transformation from 6 individuals carrying separate burdens into a unified crew capable of navigating any uncertainty together. The weight you carry as a leader, the sleepless nights spent calculating risks and rehearsing difficult decisions, these hadn't disappeared during their voyage. They had been refined, purified. The ocean had taught them that leadership wasn't about controlling outcomes. It was about maintaining steady presence while remaining completely open to forces beyond your influence. What they were building wasn't just a successful expedition. It was proof that human beings could still trust ancient wisdom, could still choose partnership over domination, could still find meaning in the patient work of moving toward distant horizons one day at a time. The island grew larger, more detailed. They could see individual trees now, beaches where waves broke in rhythmic patterns. Birds called to each other with voices that seemed to welcome these unexpected visitors from the eastern horizon. Yet something else was becoming clear as they approached. The coral reef that surrounded their destination like a protective barrier. It was going to demand one final act of surrender. The Kon-Tiki couldn't simply sail into a harbor. She would have to trust herself to the breaking waves, to the same forces that had carried her across 4,000 miles of open ocean. The crew understood this with quiet acceptance. Their faithful raft had brought them this far by yielding to the sea's power rather than fighting it. Now she would complete her journey the same way. As afternoon light slanted across the water, illuminating their approaching destination with golden clarity, 6 men prepared for arrival. They secured equipment, checked ropes, and took positions, but more importantly, they prepared their hearts. They had proven what they set out to prove. They had demonstrated that the impossible was simply the untried. They had shown that careful preparation, sustained courage, and unwavering partnership could navigate even the vastest uncertainties. The coral reef waited ahead, white foam marking where ocean met land in eternal conversation. The Kon-Tiki sailed steadily toward her destiny. carrying 6 men who had discovered that the greatest adventures begin when you stop trying to control the outcome and start trusting the process. Journey's End. Reflections on the tide. The morning sun cast long shadows across the water as the Kon-Tiki approached her final test. The living wall of coral that had grown for centuries in these warm Pacific waters. The crew moved with quiet purpose now, securing their belongings, checking their life vests, understanding that their bamboo companion would soon complete the journey she had been built for. Thor stood at the steering oar, feeling the familiar weight of leadership settle around his shoulders one last time on this voyage. But it was different now. Lighter somehow. The anxious calculations that had once kept him awake in Lima seemed like memories from another life. Here, approaching the reef with the morning light dancing on the foam, he felt only a profound sense of completion. The sound came first. That deep, rhythmic thunder of waves breaking against coral. A sound as old as the ocean itself. Then the sight of white water erupting skyward, marking the boundary between the deep blue of their ocean home and the shallow turquoise of the lagoon beyond. The Kon-Tiki had carried them across 4,000 miles of Pacific, and now she would carry them through this final passage. "Hold fast," Thor called, his voice calm and steady. There was no fear in it now, only acceptance. They had learned, somewhere in those long weeks between Peru and Polynesia, that courage was not the absence of uncertainty, but the willingness to move forward despite it. The impact, when it came, was both violent and strangely gentle. The raft lifted on a massive wave, hung suspended for a moment between sea and sky, then crashed down onto the coral with a sound like thunder. Bamboo groaned and rope stretched, but the ancient design held true. Water surged over the deck, then receded, leaving the crew gasping and laughing with the wild joy of survival. Again and again the waves lifted them, driving them further across the reef toward the calm waters beyond. Each impact was a reminder of the ocean's power, but also of their partnership with forces greater than themselves. They were not conquering this reef. They were allowing it to guide them home. When the violence finally ceased, when the last wave had pushed them into the protected lagoon, a profound silence settled over the Kon-Tiki. 6 men sat on the deck of their battered but unbroken raft, looking back at the white foam of the reef, then forward toward the palm-fringed shore of a Polynesian atoll. They had done it. The impossible journey was complete. But as they paddled slowly toward the beach, Thor realized that the true discovery was not behind them or ahead of them. It was within them. Somewhere in those 97 days of sun and salt and endless horizon, they had found something that no amount of planning could have prepared them for. They had found the patience to let the ocean teach them its rhythms. They had found the wisdom to trust in forces beyond their control. They had found the courage to embrace uncertainty as a companion rather than an enemy. The moment the Kon-Tiki's bow touched the coral sand of the beach, they became part of the story they had set out to prove. They were no longer modern men testing an ancient theory. They were the living continuation of a tradition that stretched back across centuries of Pacific voyaging. As they stepped onto solid ground for the first time in over 3 months, their legs unsteady after so long at sea, each man carried within him the memory of what they had accomplished together. Not just the crossing itself, but the transformation that had occurred along the way. They had learned to read the ocean's moods, to find sustenance in its depths, to navigate by stars whose names they had memorized in the darkness of countless nights. The weight they had carried when they left Callao, the pressure of skeptical experts, the burden of proving themselves, the anxiety of the unknown. All of it had been transformed into something else entirely, into confidence born of experience, into wisdom earned through partnership with forces greater than themselves, into the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had trusted the process and found it worthy of their faith. Thor looked back at the Kon-Tiki, her yellow sail now furled, her bamboo deck scarred by sun and salt and the passage of time. She had been more than transportation. She had been teacher, home, and faithful companion. She had shown them that the ancient ways were not primitive, but profound. That the impossible was simply the untried, that the greatest adventures begin not when you have all the answers, but when you have the courage to trust the questions. The sun climbed higher in the tropical sky, warming their faces as they stood on the beach of their dreams. 6 men who had crossed an ocean on a raft of bamboo and balsa wood. their hearts filled with the quiet peace that comes only to those who have learned to dance with uncertainty and found the rhythm beautiful beyond measure.